Good Guys and the Bad Guys is a 1969 Western film starring Robert Mitchum and George Kennedy and was directed by Burt Kennedy. Robert Mitchum stars as Jim Flagg, the aging marshal of a town called Progress, and when he learns that infamous outlaw Big John McKay has been seen in the territory, he immediately tries to put a posse together, expecting that McKay has resurfaced, hoping to rob a train that's heading for the town that's going to be delivering a huge cash shipment to the town's new bank. But things don't go quite as he planned. The Good Guys and the Bad Guys is a very lightweight Western comedy, basically, and one that also falls into the subgenre of the aging gunfighter or the end of the West Western, of which many Westerns that were made in the late 60s and moving into the 70s fell into that category as well, in which they're usually set at the end of the 1800s, possibly early 1900s. This movie's not specific on that. There's already cars on the scene in amongst all the horses, and kind of just the overall depiction of the more modern or progressive people not respecting or having much use for the older heroes who tamed the West originally. And that is all very present in this movie. It's something of a lighthearted take on Ride the High Country in some ways, not really story-wise, but more so just the overall theme of two men who are at odds initially and end up having to work together later on, and the story basically follows them and their relationship. Robert Mitchum, as I said, plays the marshal, and just to continue on with the storyline of the movie, after he hears that Big John McKay is in the area and likely about to hit the train that has all his cash headed for town, the town wants no part of that. They don't believe him. They think that Big John McKay is likely already long dead and is no threat to them whatsoever. So they promptly force Robert Mitchum's character into retirement and just kind of put him out to pasture. Robert Mitchum gives a pretty good performance in this movie. It's, of course, not his best work. That's going to be a theme of this review. It's no one's best work, likely. But he's pretty good in it, and one of the best parts of the movie. But the absolute best part of the movie is George Kennedy, and he plays Big John McKay. And he really does give a great performance in the movie. He's great as an aging outlaw who used to be the tough leader of a gang, and now has, like Robert Mitchum as the marshal, the outlaw has also been sidelined by a younger outlaw, has kind of pushed him out and taken over the gang for him, and he's kind of this old man who hangs around the gang. Speaking of the old man thing, these days we're very much more accustomed to an aging action hero in the lead. Back then, maybe Robert Mitchum and George Kennedy seemed like older actors. I didn't think they seemed that old for the way people play them up as these elderly dinosaurs, basically, from an earlier era. But nowadays, when we're seeing 70-something Rambo running around, it doesn't seem so crazy to see probably 50-ish Robert Mitchum as the star of a Western. I just thought that was interesting how things have changed since the 60s, where we're much more used to and accepting of an older action hero. But back to George Kennedy, I thought he really did give a great performance here. I thought just his whole role as the older outlaw who's kind of ashamed of the fact that he is not feared and respected by some as he once was, and that kind of fear of not being relevant anymore is present in both characters, but I think was much better realized by George Kennedy. I think in pretty much anything, he's a good dramatic player, a good actor for comedic roles. He gets to do both here, and I thought he was quite impressive and really stood out to me. Him and Robert Mitchum together, their whole relationship kind of reminded me of that of John Wayne and Robert Mitchum in El Dorado, where they kind of have a rivalry. They don't trust each other necessarily, but have to end up working together. I guess just to go off of that, George Kennedy does end up having to turn on his own gang and team up with Robert Mitchum because he has no friends left with them. They're doing things that he never would have done as an outlaw, and so he teams up with Robert Mitchum later on in the movie. As I mentioned earlier, the parallels between their characters even go so far as there are almost identical scenes dialogue-wise, where early on in the movie Robert Mitchum is talking to some men in town, and the men he's talking to have no idea who Big John McKay is and why he should have such a fearsome reputation with Robert Mitchum. And a little while later, George Kennedy is talking to some of the outlaws, and they have no idea who Jim Flagg is and why he should be such a danger to them either. So just that whole feeling of how the world has passed them by, and how in both of their worlds they're not getting the respect that they think they deserve, and just a nicely drawn parallel between the two. Both of them get some really dramatic scenes actually, where you can really get a sense of the loss of respect that they're feeling, and the fact that they're not feeling relevant anymore. And they both get scenes that kind of bring some pathos to this movie that otherwise is, as I have said several times, is not very serious or too dramatic. But they both get a couple of good scenes in that demonstrate that side of their characters and their acting range, really. In their first meeting, though, at the end of that scene, the two of them get into a fist fight together, which starts on the banks of a river and end up in the middle of the river fighting. And just to illustrate their aging and the fact that they aren't up to the action they used to have been, it's quite entertaining how they, as they're fighting, they're getting more and more tired. They're missing punches. They're just falling without even being hit. And by the end of it, they're both just exhausted, sitting across from each other almost in the river. That was probably my favorite scene of the movie. Very funny and entertaining. Martin Balsam stars as the mayor, and he is a sleazy politician in every sense of the word. I really didn't enjoy his scenes and didn't really think they added much. I'm assuming he was meant to be another comedic character, but I didn't find him very funny at all. I kind of find Martin Balsam hit and miss. You know, in something like 12 Angry Men, he's great. But in some of these lesser movies, I don't find him that impressive of an actor. And it's probably partly the script and just not a great role, I didn't think. David Carradine stars as the new leader of the gang that George Kennedy once ran, and I didn't think he brought much to the movie either. He just has to squint a lot when he's there. He's not even in the movie very much, so he didn't make much of an impact for me. His father, John Carradine, shows up later on, though. I enjoy seeing him in movies. He's can be quite funny, and he's kind of funny here. One of the conductors on the train who think they've caught a couple of train robbers when they catch Robert Mitchum and George Kennedy jumping onto the train to try and warn them of the upcoming robbery. He was quite funny in there, and I enjoyed him. To give a bit of a sense of the tone of this movie, Buddy Hackett shows up at the beginning for a brief, goofy cameo, and just kind of shows what direction this movie is going to take later on. As I said earlier, the movie was directed by Burt Kennedy. He is a pretty good director. I do enjoy some of his movies, for instance, The War Wagon or Support Your Local Sheriff, but this movie kind of falls in line with other movies of his from the era that they have a bit more salty language, or also some more suggestive scenes, which now you see it just seems kind of juvenile, all of that, when there were movies from just a few years earlier where it had none of that and they were much better because of it. And here their attempt to kind of modernize the traditional Western formula, I guess, really just doesn't work for me that well. I don't think it adds very much at all. As I've said a couple of times, the movie overall does have a very light tone, but earlier on it's very much more of a traditional Western style with some humor. But as we get closer to the end, the movie just goes full slapstick, basically. When the train is being robbed, seemingly everyone in town takes off after it on horses, in wagons, in their very rickety cars, even a couple people on on a handcar behind the train, and I'm assuming it was supposed to be kind of a replication of the land rush scene from Cimarron. I don't know. That's what it kind of reminded me of, but it overall just doesn't work. As we're getting into it, it's just getting more and more silly, for lack of a better word. It kind of takes away from some of those earlier scenes that were a bit more dramatic with the two main characters, and just kind of falls apart towards the end. The final gunfight, which is something that I always take pretty seriously in westerns, I think you really have to nail that. That's kind of your big climax of the movie, and I think it should be well shot and well choreographed. This one seems like it's probably modeled after the final gunfight from Ride the High Country, with both heroes coming out and just striding straight towards the bad guys, firing at them. And it attempts that, but it doesn't come anywhere close. It doesn't have the suspense, or is not nearly as well filmed or executed. It's over very quickly, and just did not end it very well, I didn't think. For some positives though, I thought the music from William Lava was great. The music is very catchy. It's a very rousing score. A lot of westerns from the mid 60s to late 60s I thought had really good music, and this one does as well. There's a ballad, the Ballad of Marshall Flagg, that kind of continues throughout the movie, very much like a High Noon or Gunfight at the OK Corral, where the music comes in again and there's another verse. And this one's sung by a man named Glenn Yarbrough. He kind of has a sound like Frankie Lane or Gene Pitney, and that was very, very fitting. I thought it was a pretty good song, and Glenn Yarbrough had a great voice. I think the cinematography and the scenery are two of the main selling points of the movie. The movie was shot in New Mexico. It looks like it was shot in fall, so those colors are just stunning, really. And there's really great aerial photography of Robert Mitchum riding over the mountains, and cinematography was by Harry Stradling Jr., and that all looked really good. The landscapes and all of that were very well shot. The fall colors and everything, I think if you want to read into it, it could be reflecting men in the autumn season of their lives, the autumnal colors that they're riding through. I don't think this movie is anywhere near that deep, but if you want to read into it, you could, I guess. Overall, I thought those parts were very well shot. As I've said, not really the action, so it doesn't carry on throughout the whole movie, but early on it does set you up for a good-looking Western. So you've probably gotten a pretty good sense of what I think of this movie. It's very breezy, very forgettable. I thought I had to record this pretty quickly after watching it, otherwise it would probably disappear from my mind. But if you are a Western fan or a Robert Mitchum fan, there are some things to like here. I enjoyed what I could out of it, but overall I wouldn't recommend this movie. Thanks for checking out this review. If you enjoyed it, please check back to my channel, Hildebrand Productions. Adios for now.